On the 22nd of August, 1942, the troops of Paulus's 6th Army crossed the Don River and advanced directly toward Stalingrad. The following day, the 16th Panzer Division of the Wehrmacht breached the Soviet defenses and, moving at maximum speed, covered 40 kilometers to reach the Volga River north of Stalingrad. By noon, the commanders of the German tanks could already see the outlines of the city on the right horizon. The German soldiers were so confident of imminent victory that some of them wrote letters home marked Stalingrad in anticipation of triumph. However, the city became a red Verdun, for theme a symbol of a hopeless battle. At the same time, with a growing roar, the dive bombers of the Luftwaffe's 4th Air Fleet advanced from the west toward the city like a dark swarm. Thus began the most devastating air raid in the history of the Great Patriotic War. A literal rain of fire incendiary bombs poured down on Stalingrad. Parched by the August sun, the city erupted like gunpowder. In the first 2 days of bombing, more civilians perished than in London during the entire Blitz. Many sought refuge in basements and sewer tunnels later used by Soviet troops for covert movement. The heart of one of the most beautiful cities in the Soviet Union was reduced to rubble within hours. Due to the delayed evacuation of Stalingrad's civilian population, nearly 40,000 non-combatants were killed in a single day. Initially, Paulus believed the burning city would fall easily, but the Germans failed to capture Stalingrad in one swift assault. Worse still, in late August, the attacking Wehrmacht forces faced fierce counterattacks from General Eremenko's Stalingrad front. Stalin categorically forbade surrendering the city, ordering German advances to be stopped at all costs. While Soviet forces failed to push the Germans back from the Volga, they thwarted the German command's plan to encircle 2 Soviet armies on Stalingrad's approaches. By the start of the city assault, Hitler, at Paulus's request, had reinforced the 6th Army with reserves, including 2 panzer divisions from Hermann Hoth's army. These tanks were meant to become the main striking force in the coming urban combat. The city's defense and last hope rested with the 62nd Army, which had maintained its combat effectiveness despite brutal fighting in the Don River Bend, though it was severely depleted. The army possessed about 50 operational tanks, with another 30 damaged but still functional armored vehicles dug into the ground as stationary firing positions. One such dug-in T-34 tank, commanded by Lieutenant Ivan Lubushkin, destroyed 16 German panzers in a single day, becoming a Stalingrad legend. By the way, our channel features gripping tank crew memoirs from Stalingrad. Check the link in the description. The Soviet command clearly understood that holding the city with existing forces was tactically impossible. On the 9th of September, Rodimtsov's 13th Guards Rifle Division was dispatched as reinforcements. By evening on the 12th of September, the 62nd Army received its new commander, Lieutenant General Chuikov. When Chuikov arrived, his army had already fully retreated into Stalingrad's urban area, completely isolated from other Soviet forces, and pinned against the Volga by German divisions attacking frontally and enveloping both flanks. The first urban assault commenced on the 14th of September. The shriek of dive bombers and deafening whistle of falling bombs filled the air. Through smoke and dust clouds, Wehrmacht infantry advanced behind rolling artillery barrages. The Germans identified a weak sector in the Soviet defenses, the battle-worn 112th Rifle Division, whose regiments had been reduced to just 50 to 130 men each, supported by only one howitzer and a single 76mm field gun. Through these depleted positions, German forces breached Soviet lines, advancing toward Mamayev-Kurgan before reaching the Volga's banks in an attempt to seize the central crossing point. Had they succeeded, Stalingrad's fate would have been decided that day. Only a few hundred meters of urban rubble and the tenacious resistance of Red Army troops stood between the Germans and their strategic objective. Every basement, floor, and pile of debris had been fortified into firing positions by Soviet defenders. The city's protectors fought with last-stand determination. To halt the German advance, Chuikov was forced to commit his final reserves, the few remaining operational tanks and 2 ad hoc combat groups formed from 62nd Army Headquarters staff. Every able-bodied soldier was sent to the front line. During these ferocious urban engagements, the Wehrmacht managed to capture Stalingrad's southern district and the strategic grain elevator. On the night of the 15th of September, across the Volga into Stalingrad, crossed 10,000 soldiers of Rodimtsev's 13th Guards Rifle Division. Upon reaching the shore, the troops immediately engaged in combat. German positions were located just 100 meters from the landing zone. During these days, the tactic of hugging the enemy was born. Chuikov ordered his men to maintain close proximity to German positions. This prevented enemy aircraft from bombing, without risk of hitting their own forces. The Volga crossing under fire was so perilous that soldiers called it the Death Road. Boats and barges were frequently sunk, yet those who reached the opposite shore immediately launched counterattacks. In the first 24 hours of fighting, every third guardsman fell. Rodimtsev's men managed to push back German forces from the central crossing, secure control of the railway station, and initiate combat for the strategically vital Mamayev Kurgan, which dominated the city. The slopes of Mamayev Kurgan, once a flourishing park, were now completely churned by artillery fire, with up to 1,000 shell impacts per square meter. The train station changed hands 15 times in just 5 days. Fierce fighting also raged in the southern part of the city. On the 18th of September alone, the defenders of the grain elevator repelled 10 assault attempts. As a result, the German advance in the city center was halted. Additionally, around the same time, the Stalingrad front launched a major offensive aimed at linking up with the city's defenders. The Germans managed to repel it, but only with great difficulty, and their command could no longer send reinforcements to the troops storming the city itself. On the 27th of September, Paulus's army launched its second assault on Stalingrad. Chuikov's task was to hold the city and its half-destroyed industrial sites, the Red October steel plant, the Barakati arms factory, and the oil storage facilities on the Volga's banks. Chuikov's soldiers turned these factories into veritable fortresses. Even when cut off from command, fighting in small groups or alone, our troops continued to resist. At the same time, the Red Army's strength was dwindling, but their combat experience was growing, refining new tactical methods. By reducing Stalingrad to ruins, the Germans had unwittingly created obstacles for their own assault. Tanks, the Wehrmacht's primary striking force, struggled to navigate the piles of rubble and collapsed buildings, while also becoming prime targets for Soviet soldiers, hurling Molotov cocktails with deadly accuracy from upper floors. By the way, alongside these tactics, the Red Army soldiers had another unusual weapon, the ampulomet flammable projectile launcher, which I covered in a separate video. Grenades and Molotov cocktails flew from every corner and basement. In the ruins of Stalingrad, the battle-tested German tactics of warfare proved ineffective. German soldiers referred to Stalingrad as Rattenkrieg, rat war, due to the brutal fighting in basements and tunnels where Soviet fighters emerged unexpectedly, like shadows. Artillery and aircraft were practically useless. Endless ambushes and close-quarters combat literally struck terror into them. The Red Army soldiers, entrenched in such buildings, cut down advancing German troops with precise fire, eliminating them in small groups. General Strecker, commander of the 11th Army Corps, noted that his forces were suffering heavy losses from ambushes set up in the basements of ruined buildings and destroyed factory workshops. In turn, German pilots found it increasingly difficult to identify bombing reference points in the city's ruins. From the air, it was nearly impossible to distinguish Wehrmacht positions from Soviet defenses amid the gray wasteland of rubble. In close-quarters urban combat, the distance between Soviet and German defensive lines often shrank to 10 to 30 meters. Recognizing this, Chuikov ordered his troops to advance as close as possible to German positions during bombing raids. This tactic forced the Luftwaffe to virtually abandon level bombing. The risk of friendly fire was simply too high. In Stalingrad, Ju-87 Stuka pilots were pushed to their limits, flying up to 6 combat hours daily. One German pilot noted that during 3 months of fighting here, he flew 228 combat sorties, equal to his total over the entire 3 preceding years of Second World War. Additionally, under Chuikov's orders, the long-range artillery of the 62nd Army remained positioned on the eastern bank of the Volga, where it was better protected from Luftwaffe strikes. Inside the city itself, only artillery reconnaissance teams and signals personnel were deployed, maintaining fire coordination between forward observation posts and gun positions. Meanwhile, the Germans intensified their offensive pressure, gradually pushing Red Army units back toward the Volga. On the 4th of October, German forces captured the railway station district. The critical situation of Soviet troops was alleviated when Major General Zholudev's 37th Guards Rifle Division was successfully deployed across the Volga into the city. These elite troops immediately entered combat and repulsed German forces from the tractor plant vicinity. At the same time, heavy battles were fought on the ledge near Orlovka, where the 115th Rifle Brigade of Colonel Andrusenko, fighting in a semi-envelopment, held back the advance of the 14th Tank Corps of the Wehrmacht until the 8th of October. In mid-October, after completing their regrouping of forces, the Germans launched their third assault on Stalingrad, which became the most brutal in the epic battle for the city on the Volga. The main thrust was now directed at the tractor plant sector. Against the paratroopers of the 37th Guards Rifle Division defending the plant, the enemy committed 3 infantry divisions and 2 panzer divisions. Divisional commander General Jolidev, wielding a submachine gun, fought alongside his surviving soldiers. The fresh 138th Rifle Division under Colonel Ludnikov was approaching the crossing, but they still had to hold out until its arrival. From the grounds of the tractor factory, German forces launched assaults against the Barikadi plant. Only the salvos of Katyusha rockets fired from the eastern bank of the river halted their attack. However, the soldiers of the Wehrmacht had already reached the Volga, splitting the Soviet 62nd Army into 2 parts. At great cost, the Germans managed to capture sections of the tractor factory and the Barikadi factory, but they failed to push the Red Army beyond the Volga. At the same time, German assault groups had advanced to within a few hundred meters of Chuikov's command post. In this desperate situation, the commander of the 62nd Army noted that the next 24 hours would be critical. On the 16th of October, as the fighting raged just 320 meters from Chuikov's headquarters, Ludnikov's division landed in Stalingrad and immediately engaged in combat in the area of the Barikadi factory. The advance of the German forces was halted once again. Hitler was furious that the city on the Volga had still not been captured. By the end of October, fierce fighting was raging in the workshops of the Red October factory. Less than 2 weeks later, on the 11th of November, Paulus's army launched its final offensive in Stalingrad. Near the Barikadi factory, German troops reached the Volga and encircled Colonel Ludnikov's division, splitting the 62nd Army into 3 parts. The 138th Rifle Division, also known as Ludnikov's Island, held its ground alone for a month and a half, defending a position just 200 meters from the Volga. The machine gunner of the 650th Rifle Regiment, Rosenberg, recalled, "From my machine gun to the Volga was just over 50 meters. The Germans pressed forward in their attacks, coming within 20 meters, and when things got really tough, the signalman would call in artillery fire on our own position. At some point, a kind of frenzy set in. I no longer felt any pity neither for myself nor for the Germans. We fought for every piece of wall with extreme ferocity. By that time, the front line had already shifted into the city blocks. The supply crossings, crucial for sustaining the troops, were under constant bombardment day and night. Soon, the Volga began to freeze, and ships could no longer deliver ammunition and provisions to Stalingrad. Soviet pilots and navigators made up to 12 sorties each night, but it was impossible to fully supply the Red Army soldiers with everything they needed by air. It seemed that the fate of the last defenders of Stalingrad had already been sealed. However, the situation was only restored after reinforcements were redirected to Stalingrad from the flanks. In the battles for the city on the Volga, one German division after another was consumed. Paulus was forced to deploy the elite of the Wehrmacht, the tank divisions from Hermann Göring's army, onto the streets of Stalingrad. By November 1942, Paulus's army was completely bogged down in urban warfare. The advance of German forces was halted across the entire front. The enemy was compelled to switch to a defensive posture. The German command's plan to capture Stalingrad had utterly failed. The legendary Pavlov's house has completed its 58-day defense. Back in late September, this house was recaptured from the Germans by a platoon of Soviet soldiers, later led by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov. I have discussed in a separate video why the Germans were never able to seize this building in an assault. Meanwhile, deep behind Red Army lines, intense preparations were underway for the monumental Operation Uranus. The Soviet High Command massed forces for a decisive counteroffensive, finalizing all preparations by mid-November. Striking at the flanks of the enemy's main force, troops of the southwestern and Stalingrad fronts completed the encirclement of German forces by the 23rd of November. When Hitler was informed of the envelopment, he expressly forbade a breakout attempt, instead promising to sustain the army by airlift. Yet, of the required 700 tons of daily supplies, the Germans received at best 100, a crippling shortfall. By the 2nd of February, Operation Ring culminated in the complete annihilation of the encircled 6th Army under Paulus. To explore the fate of German POWs and witness the Battle of Stalingrad through German perspectives, see the documentary series featuring memoirs of Paulus's adjutant. The Battle of Stalingrad played a decisive role in achieving a fundamental turning point, not only in the course of the Great Patriotic War, but in the entire Second World War. The Red Army seized the strategic initiative and maintained it until the war's end. The Battle of Stalingrad altered the course of the war. From here began the Red Army's march toward Berlin.